This is a guest essay by Cynthia Lazar, a retired psychiatrist and Canadian Zionist, writing about Israel and anti-Semitism.
Canadian politicians keep asserting that anti-Semitism has no place in Canada. So how did 3 of 9 senators on the committee that wrote Canada's strategy to combat anti-Semitism sign an open letter condemning Israel? The required detail to understand their actions makes this interesting. The Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights was tasked with providing recommendations to the government on fighting anti-Semitism. Their recently released report, Standing Against Anti-Semitism, Protecting Communities, and Strengthening Canadian Democracy, was applauded by mainstream Jewish organizations like the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, B'nai B'rith, and the Israeli Embassy, but questioned by a number of journalists like Aviva Klompas and even pilloried by Tristan Hopper at the National Post for failing to mention Islamist extremism. When a third of the committee cannot recognize the modern-day anti-Jewish bigotry that underlies this open letter, then their work has gone terribly wrong. There was not a single Jewish member of the 9 senators, nor did any Jewish senators take part in the hearings or writing of the report. The deputy chair, Wanda Thomas Bernard, spoke in the Senate about Gaza, insisting that Israeli actions were not about self-defense and that people are dying of starvation and dehydration. The Israeli military bombed and raided hospitals. Unlike the 3 senators who signed the open letter, Thomas Bernard spoke 2 years ago, before she had heard the testimony about anti-Semitism, and shortly after she had completed her report as deputy chair of the committee fighting so-called Islamophobia. In order to understand how this committee's work went so far off the rails, I read the 75-page report of the Senate Committee on Anti-Semitism, as well as the transcripts of all their meetings and submitted written briefs. I also read the Senate Committee's other so-called anti-racist report, Combating Hate, Islamophobia, and its impact on Muslims in Canada. That 9-person committee, exploring anti-Muslim bigotry, had 4 Muslim members and a refugee from Iran. Unlike the report on anti-Semitism, there were no included briefs or testimony from groups that vilified the minority. The 3 who signed the open letter to the Canadian government demonizing Israel on July 29, 2025, have no excuse for their level of ignorance. It is a willful refusal to identify modern-day hatred targeting Jewish communities. The open letter expressed, quote, grave concerns about Canada's continued military export to Israel and the deepening humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. In July 2025, they repeated the libel that, quote, more than 1 million Palestinians are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity, and that over 50,000 Palestinian children are killed or injured. 7 months into the work of the Committee on Anti-Semitism, they could not recognize a recycled medieval blood libel about Jews killing children, let alone modern disinformation. Were the 3 Jewish senators asked to contribute? I don't know. Throughout the transcripts of oral testimony, anti-Semitism is written with a hyphen, but in the report it was changed to anti-Semitism without the hyphen, finally recognizing that anti-Jewish bigotry has nothing to do with Semites. They would not consider an alternate name for the hatred, even though anti-Semitism is a relatively new term for the world's oldest hatred and reflects specifically Nazi racism, rather than today's iteration, so-called anti-Zionism. They focused relentlessly on right-wing, white supremacist hatred of Jews. That made them feel comfortable. The awareness that much of the Middle East imported that Nazi hatred to Muslim countries was lost upon them. The semantics, insisting on the term anti-Semitism rather than anti-Jewish bigotry, reflects a lack of understanding of the broader picture. In the report, they state, quote, the committee is keenly aware of the similarities between anti-Semitism, sexism, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, and other forms of hate, as well as the ways in which individuals can face intersectional discrimination. Their desire to force other templates upon this hatred led to a complete negation of the unique character of anti-Jewish bigotry. 2 of the 7 meetings were devoted to hearing from anti-Zionists as credible experts to discuss hatred of Jews. One was given over to zealous anti-Zionists, represented by Corey Balsam and Rabbi David Miva of Independent Jewish Voices, a group that works closely with Students for Justice in Palestine. Students for Justice in Palestine is a terror-supporting collective that organized most of the celebrations of October 7th a day later, and the university encampments in 2024. Independent Jewish Voices mailing address is the Office of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, the group pushing anti-Palestinian racism onto our institutions in an effort to criminalize Zionism. Independent Jewish Voices was joined by the virulently anti-Zionist law professor Joshua Seeley Harrington. Mr. Seeley Harrington has his own page on Canary Mission's website describing his support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, as well as the so-called pro-Palestinian encampments. He was mentioned in the Toronto Metropolitan University report as a signatory of the law school's open letter, written days after October 7th, accusing Jews of causing the massacre. He has often repeated that resistance by any means is valid. David Miva stated in his testimony, quote, "If our government didn't support the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's well-renowned definition of anti-Semitism, I think fewer people would associate Jews as a whole with the State of Israel, and their anger at Israel wouldn't be directed at the rest of us Jews." In other words, he blames Israel for anti-Semitism in Canada. Miva also called one of the most mainstream Jewish advocacy groups in the United States, the Anti-Defamation League, quote, "a racist anti-Palestinian hate organization." Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East was invited to submit a brief in which they stated, quote, "The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's handbook goes on to sanitize Zionism as simply Jewish self-determination. The perverse framing of this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance example ignores that anti-Palestinian racism is the conjoined evil twin of Zionism. The unique demonization of the Israeli state and all those who support her, that is, the vast majority of Jews, is classic anti-Jewish hatred. The committee chose to give Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East a platform to repeat anti-Jewish libels, such as all Palestinians were forcibly removed from Israel, and that the state was founded as a settler colonial project as payment for the Holocaust on the backs of Palestinian peasants. Another day was reserved for left-leaning academics arguing to rescind the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. Professor Ivan Kalmar quoted two of the greatest purveyors of modern-day Jew hatred, Edward Said and Mahmoud Mamdani, as academics he respects, who have shaped his understanding of anti-Semitism. He describes anti-Semitism as a rising intertwined with Islamophobia due to Christian bigotry. Annie Ohana, described as a, quote, "Sephardic Arabic Jewish white presenting person, started her testimony with a land acknowledgement and called herself an anti-oppression curriculum specialist. She described teaching the Balfour Declaration as step 1, quote, "of a genocide in 10 steps. She asserted that we need not erase the Nakba. People may differ in their descriptions of the war started by 5 surrounding Arab states upon the State of Israel's Declaration of Independence in 1948. However, one of the few meetings meant to remedy the plight of Jews in Canada was used instead to offer an ahistorical narrative of the origins of the State of Israel. Attributing Palestinian suffering to Israeli actions and ignoring Jewish dispossession served only one purpose: legitimizing anti-Zionism. The Jewish fig leaves fulfilled their assigned roles. Professor Kenneth Stern said he, quote, "respected Rashid Khalidi as an academic." Khalidi was Edward Said's protege at Columbia University and continued disseminating anti-Israel propaganda, as had his mentor. Stern scandalized that after the implementation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, the deeply bigoted and dangerous Israel Apartheid Week was canceled. He lamented that Khalidi had been unable to teach his usual curriculum about the history of the Middle East. Mira Sucherov, a professor at Carleton University, insisted that, quote, "Jewish institutions here in Canada need to realize that they may be fueling the wrong-headed assumption by presenting all or part of their mission as being to support Israel. To be clear, she added, quote, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same thing. She insisted that we need to ask protesters what they mean by intifada and globalize. Sucharoff wants to adopt a stance of so-called co-resistance, where Jews and Muslims come together to fight all forms of oppression. There was absolutely no understanding of the mukawama, Arabic for resistance, often defining a doctrine of persistent warfare and constant combat against perceived occupiers or oppressors, notably Israel and Western influence in the Middle East, and what that resistance actually means. She stated that, quote, a large uptick in anti-Semitic incidents is a function of what Israel is doing in Gaza. Sucharoff made this accusation on December 1, 2025, approximately 2 months after the October 9th ceasefire. The war ended exactly as Israel had promised when the hostages were returned. On October 20th, the committee chairperson asked the head of the Canadian Union of Jewish Students, how can we distinguish and disentangle the Israeli government from Jewish individuals who are being targeted? A third meeting was given to police and Stats Canada employees, who seemed to understand little about the problem. One employee insisted that anti-Jewish hate crimes declined in 2025, despite B'nai B'rith's evidence to the contrary. The representative for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canada's National Police Service, stated, quote, we are finding now that if the youth hate Jewish people, they will hate Black people, the LGBTQ community, and many others. Again, this completely negates the left that has allied with Islamists to foment the hatred of Jews. I guess he had never heard of Queers for Palestine or the pride marches that excluded Jews. Over and over again, senators emphasized that Jews should not be held responsible for the actions of the Israeli government. While holding Jews responsible for the actions of the sole Jewish state is anti-Jewish bigotry, they ignored completely the genocidally anti-Semitic propaganda from Hamas, Qatar, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and others that lead to the demonization of Israel. They briefly alluded to foreign interference, but neither Qatar nor Iran are ever mentioned in this report. There is no awareness of the Muslim Brotherhood and their decades-long plan to infiltrate media, universities, elementary education, and every level of government in an effort to destroy all Zionists and the only Jewish nation. This committee maintained their view of Israel as a pariah state, while decrying the poor treatment of Jews in Canada. If a country cannot even name the forces driving hatred against its Jews, it is not fighting anti-Semitism, it is laundering it.